Hi, it's Melissa with the Oosterhout Free Library and our next American Tall Tale by Mary Pope Osborne. This one is about Febold Feboldson, and it's very funny. And one of the funny things is I'm going to mispronounce his name the whole way, I'm sure. Before our story, though, I want to remind you that we have no contact pickup available, and we have some brand new books that I think are going to be really popular. This one is a graphic novel called The Wolf in Underpants Freezes His Buns Off. I'm sure that'll be popular because any children's book with the word underpants in the title is always a big hit. This one is called Wayside School Beneath the Cloud of Doom, which sounds right for these days. And this is a sequel to a very popular series. You can request that or any other book through no contact pickup. Our library catalog can be searched online. And so just give us a call. You can also take out this book if you've enjoyed some of the tall tales that we've been telling, and there's others in it. So now we have Feboldson, a story about the Great Plains, and some of the challenges he runs into in the Great Plains reminds me of the Little House in the Prairie books on the banks of Plum Creek. After living on the Great Plains by himself for a year, a Swedish farmer named Febold grew afraid he might die of loneliness. As he watched wagon trains bump over the prairies on their way to California, he waved his straw hat and shouted, "Stay here! Live here!" But Febold always got the same answer. "No, thank you, we're looking for gold." Instead of giving up, the broad-shouldered, sunburned Swede sat down, cupped his jaw in his giant hand, and tried to figure out a way to make the gold hunters settle near him on the plains. In 3 seconds, he came up with about 100 great ideas. But the idea that made him do a little dance was this: order 1,000 goldfish from Peru. Febold ordered the goldfish, and when they arrived, he dumped them all into a lake near his sod shanty, the only lake on the whole prairie. Then the crafty farmer hid in the tall grass and waited for the prairie schooners to roll by. It wasn't long before a small wagon train clattered over the hard-baked earth near Febold's farm. "Look! Gold!" a pioneer woman shrieked when she saw something glittering in the sunlit lake. It's just the goldfish. Febold grinned as the pioneers jumped off their wagons and charged across the prairie. From the tall grass, he watched the pioneers dipping their pans into the water. They chattered like magpies, and Febold's heart soared with joy. He saw wonderful times ahead, sharing his life with good neighbors. But as the pioneers panned for gold, the terrible dry weather of the plains began to get to them. It was so hot they were soon forced to jump into the lake to keep from drying up and blowing away altogether. "Folks, this is a terrible place to live," said Olaf Swenson, the wagon master. "It's too hot and too dry, it never rains, and we haven't found any gold in this lake all day." "You're right, Olaf. Let's move on to California," said the others. With their tongues hanging out, they all ran back to the wagon train. As the pioneers climbed aboard the wagons, Febold saw his precious dream of having neighbors start to evaporate. Before anyone could say giddy up, he jumped out of the grass and screamed, "Wait! Wait right here, neighbors, and I promise you some rain." A tall order, but Febold was desperate. He thought and thought, until he came up with about 100 great ideas. But the idea that made him do a little dance was this: build a big bonfire beside the lake. The bonfire Febold built was so big and burned so hot that soon the water in the lake vaporized and formed clouds over the prairie. The clouds were so big and heavy that when they rolled into one another, it started to rain. Buckets and buckets of rain. The problem was none of the rain hit the ground. Why? Because the air was so hot and so dry that the rain turned to steam before it even touched the land. And what happens when steam and dry land meet? Fog. So much fog covered the plains that the pioneers couldn't see a thing. "This is awful," said Olaf, groping towards his wife, Anna. "Sure is. Let's get out of here," said Anna. But as they stumbled back towards the wagon, Febold shouted, "Wait! I'll get rid of the fog." Then he ran to his shanty and came out with a giant pair of clippers. The pioneers gaped as Febold snipped the fog into long strips. Then they watched him bury the strips in his field. When all the fog was buried, the rain from the clouds crashed to the ground. Everyone shouted for joy. But then a silly thing happened. A thin piece of fog seeped out of the ground and wafted through the air. It looked just like a ghost. The clouds saw it, and they ran away in fright, leaving the day right back where it had begun, unbearably hot and dry. "We can't live here without rain," cried Olaf. "Wait," said Febold. "I'll get more rain. Just give me a minute to think." He cupped his large jaw in his giant hand and thought, until suddenly he came up with a new plan. "Noise," he announced. "Noise?" asked Anna. "Didn't you ever notice it always rains when there's a lot of noise? 4th of July fireworks, parades, battles, outdoor dances." Said Olaf. "Well, nothing makes more noise than frogs," said Febold. The pioneers rolled their eyes at each other, but before they could say anything, Febold ran out to the fields, gathering all the frogs that lived on his farm. Thousands of them, frogs of all sizes and dispositions. His plan was not as simple as it looked, though. He soon discovered that frogs only make noise when they're good and wet. So he grabbed one cheerful-looking frog and whispered in its tiny ear, "It's raining, it's raining, it's raining." Febold kept this up until he had completely hypnotized the frogs. And when it started to croak, the others began to croak too. And soon every single frog was singing its heart out, and the rains came. As the rains fell, Olaf, Anna, and the others jumped for joy and cried, "Yes! We'll stay on the plains and build our farms. Miracles happen on this land." But disaster was just around the corner. The next day the pioneers discovered that they couldn't get their fence posts into the ground because the soil was still hard. "If we can't fence our properties, how in the world can we tend to our horses, cows, sheep, oxen, dogs, chickens, and children?" said Olaf. "We can't stay in this terrible place." "Oh, for goodness sakes," thought Febold, but he just smiled and said, "Wait, I'll teach you an old prairie trick." He gathered all the pioneers together for a lesson. "This is how you make and keep post holes on the Great Plains," he said. 1. Bore a bunch of holes in the hard ground. 2. Let the holes freeze all winter. 3. In the spring, before the ground thaws, dig up the holes. 4. When the frozen holes come out of the ground, slap coats of varnish on them. 5. Slip the varnished holes back into the ground. 6. Insert fence posts. Well, you might say this was the beginning of a true change of heart for the pioneers. They were so intrigued with Febold's post-hole procedure, they were willing to wait for winter to come to try it out. Before they knew it, Febold was teaching them how to make sod shanties with bricks of matted prairie turf, how to grow wheat and corn, how to plow the barren land, how to fight grasshoppers, tornadoes, dust storms, and prairie fires. This is the part that reminds me of On the Banks of Plum Creek. Olaf and Anna grew quite content with their new life. As they walked through the tall, whispering grass in the twilight, they watched the goldfish slapping the dark waters under the moon. They listened to the frog choruses practicing their rain songs, and they smiled at Febold as he waved from his shanty and said, "Evening, neighbors."